It's recording.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sohail, for being with us today in this TechnoFutures 2020 conversation. For those who don't know Sohail Inayatullah is a renowned futurist and political scientist. He is professor at the Tamkang University in Taiwan. He also teaches in the Business School of Melbourne, and he also ran the platform called Metafutures for futures training. Besides that, he is the author of more than 25 books. He has written more than 350 articles, and he is the editor-in-chief of Journal of Future Studies and some other publications. Today we are going to talk about utopias. Since Paco Jariego and myself opted to launch, to push for TechnoFutures, we aimed to create a community of brave and creative people interested for the future in Spain and abroad. And during the latest months, we've been working in a book that contains a collection of utopias for the future. So Sohail, may I ask you to give us a little introduction about why and how utopias are relevant for future studies?
Thanks so much. It's one of my favorite topics. One type of futures is to focus on today and move towards tomorrow. That's very relevant for decision makers, for policymakers, prime ministers. They don't want to go too far. They want little steps. The other type of future is let's go to the distant future. Let's go to the ideal state. Let's imagine the unimaginable. So that's utopian thinking. And that can have a more profound impact on decision-making, policy-making, and strategy. So I really enjoy moving organizations and nations towards utopian thinking. Now, the way we start to think about this is to look at the image of the future. There's no data in the future, but we have images. So we want to start so the image normalizes, it prepaves, it starts to suggest what's possible. So one of my colleagues, Oliver Markley, he suggests the image leads reality. So our imagination of what's possible is ahead of what's today. So many people always say, well, that's interesting, but that's not real. That's interesting, but what about geopolitics? That's interesting, but what about? And Oliver says, yes, that's true. The present is important, but we're trying to create the new image, and the image is ahead. It foretells what can be. If you go back 50, 60 years ago, this was a normal commercial when I was a young person in the US. More doctors smoke Camel than any other cigarette. It was the notion that tobacco is normalized. It's the tall, white male doctor smoking. So this was an image of the future. Then we see the image change. 15 years ago in Melbourne, when they did some research, they found out 34% of doctors in Victoria have trained in meditation. 77% believe it should be funded by the government. 80% have referred patients to complementary medicine. So you see this shift from tobacco as the norm to meditation as the norm. Now today we see the image emerging, what's called the avatar health. The avatar does your early diagnostics. Then you see the doctor. So it's real-time interactive artificial intelligence, again changing the nature of what's health. One of the entry companies I'm working with, they started to imagine health in the 2050s, 2070s, the next century. They said they want energy and health to be a genie with a crystal ball, customer-centric, real-time information, predictive analytics, resolving your energy issue, your health issue. Every person gets a genie. And we're seeing some of the AI artilects already starting to do that. So the image starts to imagine the future. But does the image create reality? That's our next question. The image leads, does the image create? Go back 120 years. This is one of the first imaginations of what today we consider normal. It was a painting the year 1900 or so, and they imagined the year 2000. You can see there's a visual image. He's speaking. And then in Paris, they said, aha, this will make declarations of love easier. We'll be able to share the results of horse racing easier. So now there's the imagination, and they're saying, what are practical examples? Then you go further. Then suddenly someone says, aha, what would a television newspaper look like? What would a newspaper look like that had text and video? Then you go further, Western electorate says, let's cross a telephone with a TV set. So now suddenly the image is slowly becoming real. Then we have Skype 103 years later. And now as we go further, we start to imagine this is the first imagination of virtual education. The image prepaves what's possible. Of course, it can be negative. The students are not active, they're passive. We know the best education is engagement, not the lecture, but peer-to-peer learning. And now you see this. If we look at the technologies that we have today, they're imagined by writers in the 50s and 60s. Then it went to TV shows, it went to movies, and now it's become real. The utopian image creates the context of what we think is possible. Thus, it's critical, important to think through what images do we want. In his amazing book, Fred Pollock, The Image of the Future, he says actually the utopian themes have always been ahead. They arise as fantasy and become reality. Scientific management, full employment, social security, parliamentary democracy, universal suffrage, the trade union movement, taking care of children, the emancipation of women, how long we work, how do we share profit. These were always utopian imaginations. Utopia becomes reality. And this is the task of future studies. Ashish Nandi said, the task of future studies is to make imaginative leaps, to jump. You won't be right, but this process of learning to make leaps starts to create the new future, helps us create the even more human future. With one country we're working with, they're trying to imagine 2050, 50 and 2070, moving from GDP to well-being, asking if well-being is how we define ourselves, what would infrastructure look like? So we're working with the scientific officers, the cabinet members to start to imagine this 2070 reality. However, it can go bad. Nandi says today's utopias, unless resisted, may become tomorrow's nightmares. Utopias are not neutral. We have to learn how to read utopias. Look at this utopian image. We were working with the city on the future of that city. And one artist imagined this. It's all flying cars. Where are the people? The utopia was infrastructure without people. Then they asked a young girl, Ashley, 11. She imagines the same future. Look at her imagination. There's people. There's nature. There's community. There's connection, and there's technology. So we have to learn how to read utopias, critically understand what we want, what we don't want. 20 years ago, I was working with a group and we were focused on the year 3000. They had a large budget. They brought together geneticists, physicists, futurists, social scientists, and we started to imagine the year 3000. One of the main paintings was this. This was their utopian imagination. But if you read it critically, look, the sun is over the head of the male. It's a nuclear family. You start with dinosaurs and you end space. It's one imagination. The great thinkers are heads without bodies. Is that the future we want? Perhaps. Then you ask someone else, what's your imagination of the year 3000? In this imagination, the future rests on the ancestors, on indigenous knowledge. The tree is supported by spirit. There's technology that advances us. There's multiculturalism. Children are together. So this is a similar imagination of the year 3000, but it includes future generations, includes indigenous knowledge, includes spirit. So as we think about utopia, there's choices to be made. Do we want futures that show us evolving, becoming more complex, an integrated planet with gender cooperation, technology for all, thriving nature? Or do we want to fragment and tell stories about dystopias? Dystopian stories can help as warnings, but if they start to become the only way we're thinking, then we're getting lost. We're going on a river to sewage. We want a river that transforms, makes us better than we are today. There can also be personal utopias. I'm touched by the story of this one tennis player. When he was young, they asked him, "Who do you wish to be? What do you wish to do?" And he kept on talking about winning Wimbledon. He kept on making little trophies out of toys. So he was always visualizing, imagining the future. And one of the tournaments he won, he kept on visualizing again his young child coming to him and being happy and hugging him as he got the trophy. So the imagination is not just for civilization, the planet, the imagination can be also for us. What are our personal utopias? Which futures do we want? And there's empirical research that supports that. Those that imagine an activity were more likely to accomplish it. Of course, imagination is not the only variable, but it's clearly one variable. Imagine, practice. Imagine, discipline. Both are necessary. So this comes down to back to the dream. What's our desired vision? Where do we wish to go, personally and collectively? If you remember the words of Nelson Mandela in 1952, one day I'll be the first Black president of South Africa, 1952. He imagines it. It's impossible, truly impossible in 1952. How can one imagine? He made a utopian statement. In 1994, he becomes the first Black president of South Africa. Before he passes away and leaves us, he remarks, "It always seems impossible until it's done. It always seems impossible until it's done." The purpose of utopian thinking is to make the impossible possible, to help us and move us towards this image. The question I ask every country, organization, group, individual we work with: what is impossible today, but if possible, changes everything in your nation, city, organization? So this is the utopian question. It begins the conversation. It takes us out of the present, it makes a distance and helps create the future we want and avoid the future we don't want. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sohail. It was really insightful and beautiful presentation. So really love it. Especially this sentence or this idea that images lead reality. Fully agree with this. So Paco, before we conclude our short conversation today, you have something you want to comment to Sohail?
Well, hello, Sohail. A pleasure to hear you. I would have a tons of questions just looking to the or hearing to the presentation, but I would like to ask you one question, one very specific question. We are writing and we've been looking into the question of relationship between science fiction and future anticipation and utopia, etc., etc. And the conclusion, more and more, this is my experience across my professional experience, etc. But my provisional conclusion is that for some reason I do not understand, Spain is a nation with serious problems imagining the future. The sentence is not mine. It's from a researcher that has been looking at that. Could you give us an insight on what could be the reason? You put a lot of emphasis in the images, metaphors, the myths that push us into the future, etc., etc. Do you think that the language, do you think that it's the culture? Just a clue.
What I've noticed is I don't know the right answer there, but I can tell you possible answers. Answer one: when a country has too much history, futures orientation is difficult. Too much history means we dwell on the past. The history is rich, history is brilliant, the history is wonderful, and the history is a weight. So that could be answer one. So then often we use history as a way to create the utopia. When I was teaching at the University of Hawaii, one of my favorite students, he imagined a future for Oceania the Pacific Ocean. What if Captain Cook had not landed? What would have happened the last few? So this was a reverse future. One event doesn't happen, what was our world look like? It's a hypothetical that changes history. So when history is too thick, then you ask hypotheticals to shift history. That creates a doorway to a future.
That's fantastic, because that's imply that somehow we would need to do just the opposite to what we are trying to do today, which is to forget a bit about the past.
So tell a different past to create a different future. Because that's one thing as futurists we do.
Mm-hmm.
We see time as our tool, not as a given. It's something we can manipulate. It's malleable. We can play with it. So the playfulness can start to create alternative futures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We are looking for what could be our next conversation for 10 of Futures 2021. So what you mentioned about uchronias, like thinking what would have happened if something would not have happened, it could be a good starting point to rethink the past. We'll see. So I don't know if you have something more to comment, both of you, Paco or Sohail. Otherwise, I just want to thank you for being with us today, this morning. Let's make this short and we'll make it much more of those soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.